to the bone.
When it comes to forensic anthropology, novelist Kathy Reichs knows how to put some meat on the bones.
When I started writing this series, I don't think anyone had ever heard of forensic anthropology.
If you've heard of the television show Bones, then you've already heard of Kathy Reichs. The hit show was based on her alter ego, Dr. Temperance Brennan, the central character in her series of best-selling novels about a forensic anthropologist who feels the need for uncovering the truth about the dead down deep in her bones. When you write up your reports on a real case, do you find yourself starting to become as descriptive as you are in your books?
You know, I don't think it enters into my writing the cases, but it enters into my observation. Now I also observe detail I might not have noted before, like what does a fly sound like when it's buzzing in the autopsy room? Or what is the components of that smell of a decomposed body?
Not the sort of details that make great dinner conversation, right?
Especially during the meetings, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. We'll go out to dinner and I'm told we have cleared entire restaurants because we're discussing cases and details and people quietly pay their bill and leave.
In her latest book, A Conspiracy of Bones, Kathy Reichs has Dr. Brennan trying to discover the identity of partial remains found in the woods. But what she finds along the way leads her on a path down into the dark web and even darker secrets.
The public has become much more aware of the power of science and aware of what forensic science is. We just were working away in our labs and nobody paid any attention to us. And then all of a sudden, somewhere in, the mid-90s, we became hot.
Kathy Reichs, thanks very much for joining us today. So, Temperance Brennan, the heroine of your book, is a forensic anthropologist. You are a forensic anthropologist. Quite a coincidence there.
Isn't that amazing? We found each other.
So, what is a forensic anthropologist?
We're physical anthropologists with a specialty in the human skeleton and additional training such that we can identify human remains. We can help in coming up with if it's a completely unknown set of remains, we tell the police the age, the sex, the race, the height, all those factors so they can try to get the person identified. The other thing we do is we address cause of death. And we work on bodies that can't have a normal autopsy because they're burned or mutilated or mummified or decomposed or dismembered or just bones. So we help with ID and we help with cause of death. Sometimes we answer questions about, what happened to the body after the person was dead?
We know from reading your books that bones can tell you a lot of things, but what are some of the things that bones cannot tell you?
Oh, there are a lot of things they can't tell us. For example, if cause of death was by poisoning, we're not going to see that, or smothering. Unless there's a fractured bone, we're not going to see that. It's got to be something that leaves its mark on the bones or teeth.
The cases that you profile in your books are fictional, but how many of the details are from actual cases that you've worked?
It varies from book to book, but it's always based on something I've done. Sometimes it's a case, a specific case. And when I do that, like the first book, Deja Dead, is based on a serial murder case I worked on in Montreal. I'll take a nugget, a core idea from the case. For example, in that case, there was a dismemberment of one of the victims, and I was asked to see if I could find out what kind of tool was used, which I could not because it was a straight edge knife. But what was interesting was the manner in which the perpetrator had gone about doing the dismemberment. So I took that idea and then I asked myself, okay, well, what if this and what if that and what if that? And then I spin it off into fiction.
Zombie ants, they're in the book. Is that a real thing?
Zombie ants are real. And as I do an outline of the book and I know how it's going to flow, but I'm constantly reading. And if I read something as I'm writing a book, and it's really interesting to me. I think, whoa, that's going in. I'm going to work that in somehow. So that's where I had read this article about these zombie ants, that the virus is a particular virus, although now it turns out there's more than one, invade the brains of these ants, and then they can like robot control them into moving into environments favorable to the virus.
So when you go to write up a case, do you find that you write them up as descriptively now as you write them in your books?
I don't think it enters into my writing the cases, but it enters into my observation, because normally as a scientist, you're trained to be very observant on whatever it is your particular piece of the puzzle is. With me, it's the victim, him or herself. So I'm very attuned to observing detail. But now I also observe detail I might not have noted before, like what does a fly sound like when it's buzzing in the autopsy room? Or what is the components of that smell of a decomposed body? So those kinds of things, I'm either more observant or I'm thinking, well, how would you describe it, much more than I used to.
There are some pretty graphic details in the book. I don't think it's giving too much away to say that it involves a body that's been found that has no face, which is a pretty big obstacle.
Yes, it is. He's got no face, no hands, no teeth. So the body can't be identified by dental records. It can't be identified visually. It can't be identified by fingerprints. So it's a classic type of case that would go, and it's mutilated by, as we learned quickly, it's been scavenged by feral hogs. That idea came from a case I worked on in Ottawa, near Ottawa, in the Gatineau. So it's a typical case for a forensic anthropologist. And yet in this book, Tempe is on the outs. She's been exiled because there's a new boss in the Mecklenburg County, the Charlotte medical examiner office, and this new boss can't stand her and will not call her in to work on anything. So Tempe's kind of having to go rogue. Well, she's totally having to go rogue in this book, and that's new for her.
Is it new for you, too, in the sense that you never actually had to go rogue on your own?
I would not, I don't do some of the things our heroine does. I don't go out and dig up bodies by myself. Although I will say she did that in the first book. She doesn't do that later in the series. But no, I've never had to go rogue. I've worked on independent cases where I'm hired by just an individual entity or citizen. Or the second book is based in part on a case I did for the Catholic Church, but then I changed all the names and the dates and the century, actually.
Do you have to force yourself to hold back a little bit when you start getting into some of those grisly details?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say I hold back, but what I will not do, because I think my readers read my stuff because they like the authenticity of it. They like to know what's going on at a crime scene, what's going on at an autopsy. What I will not do is put in anything just for grisly sensationalism. If it's there for a purpose to make the experience seem more real or to move the story along, I'll put it in. But I'm not just going to throw in, gory stuff just to make it more sensationalist.
Do you kind of have to check yourself in real life? We've got friends who are doctors, and it seems like every time we go out to dinner with them, just as soon as the food comes, that's when they decide to start talking about lancing boils and stuff like that.
Especially during the meetings, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, there's something like 3,000 of us that get together, and forensic dentists and pathologists and anthropologists and forensic chemists. And anyway, we'll go out to dinner, and I'm told we have cleared entire restaurants because we're discussing cases and details, and people quietly pay their bill and leave.
I've been a lot of funeral directors through the years, and it's always struck me that many have a kind of an odd sense of humor. Maybe it's a defense mechanism, I don't know. Is there that sort of gallows humor in your line of work?
Yeah, there is some dark humor in the autopsy room. It's a tension releaser, is what it is. The only time there's no jokes at all is when it's a child. When an autopsy is being done, it's a child homicide yeah.
How much of what drove you as a forensic anthropologist was about science as opposed to justice?
I think it's both. I can't speak for everyone, but certainly that's what appeals to me. Giving it's a cliche, but cliches exist for a reason. Families want closure. They want answers. They may not like the answers, but they'd rather know than not know. So there is that satisfaction. There's a satisfaction if you can testify in court. Not everything I work on is criminal activity. Some cases, an older person wanders into the woods and dies, and 2 years later, their bones are found, that kind of thing. But if it is a criminal and someone has perpetrated violence against another human being, it's satisfying to be able to testify and be one part of the team that helps get that person off the streets. So there's that. It's also solving the puzzle. And can you figure out, working on the bones and working backwards, who was it or what happened to them? It's that puzzle. And I think it's a little bit of what appeals to the readers of thrillers and murder mysteries. Can you solve the puzzle before you get to the end of the book? Because the author, their job is to plant clues, and some are legitimate and some are red herrings, and that's fair. And your job as a reader is to sort through them and figure out the answer. And I know if I figure it out before I finish the book, I'm always a little disappointed in the author.
As the title of the book suggests, a conspiracy of bones, you get into a lot of conspiracy theories in the book. Was that an attempt to kind of tap into the zeitgeist of today?
Absolutely. And that's the theme of the book on two levels. On the broad level is, how does the average person sort through all of the information and disinformation that's out there? Because anybody can start a blog or a website or get on the radio and internet and say whatever they want. So how do you sort through what's real and what's not real? And it's not just coming from, wingnut crackpots. Part of it's coming from people in authority, so especially down our way. So how do you sort through all that? And that's also what's happening with Tempe in this book on a personal level, because she's got some health issues. And for the first time in her life, she is having to question her own perceptive abilities. How much can she rely on herself? And that's really new to her. And at one point in the story, there's a fire and she loses all her physical evidence, her laptop computer, her photograph, all of that. And the only thing she has is what's in her head. And can she rely on it? So what's real and what isn't? So that's the theme on both those levels.
Have you ever lost a critical document in a situation like that?
I have not had evidence lost like that, but I do share her physical, she has a cerebral aneurysm, unruptured. She had surgery for it, and she's fine, although she's having some issues with migraine headaches and the medications. I had a cerebral aneurysm, unruptured, and I did have the surgery, and it was like no big deal. So I'm fine, but Tempe's having a little holdover. I figured if I had to go through that, she has to go through that. So.
Now, Tempe is based on you, but I'm wondering if there are qualities that you have given her that you personally don't have but wish you did.
Well, yeah, she's a little braver than I am, I think. She does go out and pursue leads, I guess you'd say, which I don't. She becomes a lot more involved in an investigation than your typical forensic scientist would. We work in the lab. In my case, I work in the lab. I might go to a death scene to help in the recovery of human remains. I testify in court, but I don't really go along with a Seeley Booth or an Andrew Ryan in the investigation.
I thought it was interesting that there's so much technology involved in this science, and yet it seems more often than not the first thing that Tempe does is go to Google.
Well, isn't that what we all do? Who is this guy, John Smith? And then you Google him. So she does. She does internet research, but she does a lot more than just that. In this case, for example, she collects suspicious bone samples that she hopes will be helpful. She does an analysis on those. And of course, she does the analysis on everything she can get her hands on, since she's barred from the actual body.
DNA, of course, has been such a game changer in this field, but I'm wondering, is the DNA ever wrong?
Yes, that can happen, but I think in those cases, it's not the DNA that's wrong. It's the protocol that was used, or operational error, as we might say.
All that technology that Tempe uses, does all that really exist?
Oh no, for sure. I don't make anything up, and that was true with the show as well. Now, on television, we push the limits. in the writer's room, we would always say, well, is it plausible? Yeah, it's plausible. It's not likely, but it's plausible. So yes, what I use in the books, everything exists. Does the average lab have all of that technology and equipment and funding? Probably not, but if I use it, it does exist.
Even those giant holograms and scanners and things that are in the TV series?
Yes, that was a three-dimensional holographic reconstruction apparatus or something. It was used, where did I see it? I think I saw it in a special on analyzing King Tut is where I got the idea.
One of the great characters in the book is Tempe's 80-year-old mother, who oddly enough is kind of a computer expert. Is that based on anybody you know?
No, she's just a lot of fun, I think. She's got her issues. Daisy, she goes by Daisy. As we get little hints about it from Tempe's childhood, her mother's probably what we'd call bipolar today. She's up, or whatever we're calling that today. She's up, had her ups and had her downs, and had periods where she completely disappeared. But one time when she was at some sort of institution or rehab center, Tempe brought her a computer thinking, well, this will give her something to do. It'll be a little hobby. Well, Daisy went nuts and loved it and took every course you could imagine. And she's now more savvy than, a 12-year-old hacker would be. So she's a big help to Tempe in some situations.
Think she could handle a Zoom call?
I think she could probably handle it, yes, and tell you 15 different ways you can make it even better. She introduces in this book, Tempe's heard of the dark web, but Daisy really introduces her to the concept and to the means to get down there and poke around.
As you mentioned earlier, Tempe has a lot of friction with her boss because her boss is kind of a showboat. Is that a common thing in this field?
I have known some people like that. They have not been my boss, which is fortunate that I have had at least one colleague that was toxic in the workplace. I introduced the idea that there was going to be a new boss in a short story, which was called First Bones. And it appeared 2 or 3 years ago in a book called The Bone Collection. And it's an origin story for Tempe. It explains how she came to be a forensic anthropologist, which is my origin story because I didn't train to do that initially. And in that story, we learned that her longtime forever boss in Charlotte is murdered. So as this book opens, there is now a new boss in town. And Tempe and Margot Hebner have history together, and they do not get along. Tempe criticized this woman in the past, and this woman has never forgiven her. So she has vowed Tempe will never enter the Emmy office again.
You were one of the producers of Bones, which is a procedural show. There's sure a lot of them out there these days. Do they create this expectation that cases can always be solved?
I think it does that. It definitely raises expectations. And when I've testified in cases, both opposing and both sides, the counsel will probably say something to the jury about that and not to have overly high expectations of the technology. And also that in every case, you're not going to have DNA evidence. And I think maybe because of television, people, even if it's a fender bender, they expect DNA testing. I think it's good, though, in that the public has become much more aware of the power of science and aware of what forensic science is. When I started writing this series, I don't think anyone had ever heard of forensic anthropology. We just were working away in our labs and nobody paid any attention to us. And then all of a sudden, somewhere in the mid-90s, we became hot and forensic science became very hot, very sexy. And you're right, it's on all over the place. Books and even books that didn't in the past mention forensic science at least have to now give it passing recognition and that there's an autopsy or whatever.
What do you suppose is the attraction to people?
What I write are, murder mysteries. They're good old-fashioned murder mysteries. Somebody got killed and then you got to figure out who did it and why. Murder is one of the few crimes you have to figure out motive. That's not true for robbery or, kidnapping or what. But the difference is my stories the solution is driven by science rather than gut instinct or good old-fashioned police legwork or Agatha Christie type just intellectual intuition, that sort of thing. So why this new interest in doing it? And not everyone does it that way. There are still books being written like Agatha Christie type books, but I don't know. People just became it's a feedback cycle, I think, because as people became interested, we began writing this kind of book. And as they read this book, they wanted more of them. And so it's a feedback loop.
Is there a case, Kathy, that you work that still haunts you to this day?
Oh, I guess the ones that don't get solved. One of the kickoff points, I guess you'd say, for my 10th book, I think it was, Bones to Ashes, was a case of this little child that was found on the border between Quebec and New Brunswick. And that's a true case. It's that child is still in the lab up in Montreal. He's never been identified. He or she. We think we may have an ID. A little boy that was killed way back in the 60s. Long, complicated story, but it's never been identified, that little skeleton.
Have you kept a set of side notes through the years when you're working, of details that you run across and you think, hey, that would actually be pretty good in a story?
Well, I do have a file folder called Future Stories, and it's not so much notes from cases I worked on as clippings, things I read in the paper, or journal articles that I've read, or presentations by colleagues at our national meetings, our professional meetings. I may jot down some notes from that. So I do have a folder of future ideas and occasionally, usually I've got the idea for the next book before I finish the one I'm currently writing.
How do you keep it all straight in your head?
Well, yeah, sometimes I don't. Yeah.
Some writers talk about sometimes not knowing where the story is going and the characters kind of take over. Does that happen to you?
Well, you're the one at the keyboard. You have the delete key. I mean, you're in control. Some days that happens. And then the way I write is each chapter is a separate file. So when I shut down at the end of the day, when I open up again the next day or whenever it is, I start at the beginning of the chapter and I work my way through all the way to where I left off. Editing as I go.
Do you surprise yourself sometimes with something you've written?
I think so, yeah. And if one day I write something and I open it up the next day and look at it and think, what was I thinking? What I do is I cut it out and I put it in a dump file. I keep a file called dump. I never go back to the dump file. I've never in 19 books used anything, but it's like, I wrote that. I'm going to just put it over there rather than just delete it.
Never spit in the trash can, right?
Yeah.
So viewers of the TV series obviously can picture somebody as Tempe, Emily Deschanel. But I wonder if this was ever a movie, if you have an actor in mind to play Skinny Slidell, the private eye who was her sidekick through this adventure.
You gotta love Skinny. Yes, there's an actor named Bruce McGill. I don't know if you know Bruce. He's been in a billion things. You can Google him. My first recollection of Bruce is way back in Animal House. He played D-Day, the guy that drove the motorcycle up the staircase. And then most recently, he was in Lincoln, the feature film, and he was also the cop on Rizzoli and Isles, the series based on Tess Gerritsen's books. I think Bruce would be great.
Has there ever been talk about making these books into movies?
No, because I optioned the character for the TV show. I optioned the character to 20th Century Fox. And we were on air for 12 years. We're still the longest running scripted drama in the history of Fox. We're pretty proud of that. And we're still on, we're not in production anymore, but we're still on, I don't know where we are now, Hulu and TNT and all over the place. So I don't actually know the legality of the character, if I have the rights back, reverted back to me or not.
Are you still doing forensic work today?
Not so much. I did all of the work for the province of Quebec at the main medical legal lab there for, well, I'm not going to tell you how long. It's in decades, let's put it that way. But there came a point when I was writing a Temperance Brennan book every year. I was writing a young adult book every year, and I was writing a screenplay for the TV series. So something had to give. So I eased out of doing forensic work pretty much. I'm still available if they really need me, but I'm not doing it on a full-time basis.
I'm wondering if writing these books gives you a certain satisfaction of being able to always solve the case, when, of course, in real life, that doesn't happen.
Well, there is that. There is that. I mean, you do have 50 minutes in an episode, or you do have 350 pages in a book, and you do know that, with one exception. There was one exception, I think it was my 10th book, where the villain was not caught. But that was the only time. The puzzle was solved, but the villain got away. And then I was able to revisit that 10 books later, 10 years later, 10 books later. So yeah, there is a satisfaction in being able to wrap everything up and boucle la boucle. I think there's the French, buckle the buckle French phrase.
Well, the book is A Conspiracy of Bones. It's a great read, and locally it's available at the Novel Neighbor in Webster Groves. Kathy Reichs, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.